Welcome to Unsheltered Conversations, the podcast from HomeAid, where we dig into the stories, ideas, and systems shaping how we support people experiencing homelessness across the United States. I'm Scott Larson, CEO of HomeAid America. Today, we're honored to be joined by two leaders whose work in both storytelling and service deepens our understanding of homelessness in America. Brian Goldstone, journalist and author of the critically acclaimed There's No Place for Us, Working in Homelessness in America, a book that has landed on multiple best books of the year lists and reshapes how we think about who is counted and who is left out in America's housing crisis. As well as Brian, joining us is Mandy Crater, Executive Director of HomeAid Georgia, whose leadership has helped catalyze multiple housing developments, community partnerships, and initiatives that make dignity and stability possible for families across Atlanta and now throughout the whole state of Georgia. Brian and Mandy, welcome to our podcast, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Thanks, Scott. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So, Brian, let me start to begin, because many in our listening audience may not be familiar with you or your book, but I first became familiar with it this last fall because it was in a group chat that I was in an attainable housing group that mentioned it as a good read. And as I picked it up, your book really reframes how we think about homelessness and focusing on working homeless families and people who hold jobs, often full-time, yet cannot attain or afford stable housing. Mm-hmm. Can you help our listeners understand this trend and actually what drew you into it to actually create the book itself?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the really startling realities that my book is trying to demonstrate is that not only in Atlanta, where the book is based, but really in cities across the country, a low-wage job is homelessness waiting to happen. And, I was pretty stunned to discover in the course of reporting this book that homelessness today in America is not only, the man or woman who might be sleeping outside of a convenience store, asking for a dollar or two outside of a convenience store. It's just as often today someone who is working in that very convenience store, who is stocking the shelves, who is checking you out at the register. How I came to this subject, how I came to this project, it was actually through my wife, who is a nurse practitioner. And we had recently moved to Atlanta in 2018 from New York. And my wife was working at a community health center in Atlanta called Mercy Care. She began to notice this trend among her patients where, one patient after another, they were driving for Uber or Lyft. They were driving for DoorDash. They were employed in, caregiving positions like home health aides or daycare workers. In one case, there was actually a man who was helping build sets for Atlanta's burgeoning film industry and was sleeping in an encampment. All of these men and women who my wife was meeting, when they were finishing work, they weren't going to a home. They weren't going to an apartment. They were sometimes sleeping in the very car they had just done Uber and Lyft runs to the airport in. They were crowding into apartments with others in really precarious, unstable, very temporary situations. They were going to these abysmal, really squalid extended stay hotels. Hopefully we'll have a chance to delve a little bit into the world of extended stay hotels, because I argue in the book that these hotels constitute increasingly a really crucial node in the ecosystem of American homelessness, but these hotels have gone largely uninvestigated in the literature on homelessness and research on the subject. So that's what my wife was noticing when she told me about it. I was very, very surprised. In addition to being a journalist, I have a PhD in anthropology. I had done a lot of work over the years on economic injustice around the globe. I had read books about homelessness. I had read books about housing insecurity, and I had never really seen the link between work and homelessness explicitly thematized, much less properly examined. And on the contrary, when I went back and looked at some of that literature, when work was described, it was what was missing. Work was positioned or framed as an exit from this most severe form of deprivation, not as an accompaniment to it. Peter Rossi's Down and Out in America, a classic text on homelessness, had it that those who are homeless in this country are unconnected to the world of work. And suffice it to say, that is not what I began to see as I dove into this subject. And I ended up writing about one family in Atlanta who was homeless despite the mother's full-time job as a home health aide. And when I was finished, I realized I had only scratched the surface. And I ended up expanding that into following 5 families, kind of immersing in their day-to-day lives as they work and work and work some more. And it simply was not enough to secure one of these most basic human necessities, a roof overhead.
Yeah, and we'll get into that a little bit. And I do want to come back to the extended stay concept or the reality of what that is in communities across the country. But you touched on an important part with your wife. These individuals that were coming into her world were not invisible, but they're invisible to most people because they don't see them at that point of crisis. But your wife in the medical world was seeing them. And you're right. If you take an Uber and a Lyft, you may not realize that driver is sleeping in that car that evening or with their family, et cetera. So you're definitely touching on a key component that is invisible. And we'll talk probably in our conversation today a little bit about the point in time count. You touch on that in the book and how it's an undercount. And we'll come back to those in a little bit. But as you mentioned, your book follows these real families in Atlanta and people that some of them were trying to start businesses and they were living in the extended stay motels. They went through COVID and, there were families that received vouchers, the Section 8 vouchers, but there were no affordable rentals that were available, and others that were the extensiveness of deposits and unrefundable deposits to try to get into it. And then the scams that were involved with it. You really touched on many, many things. Can you dive a little bit more into that for our listeners about the rent growth and wage stagnation and other things that might be limiting these very vulnerable populations in your community?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, not only are these families and not the tens of thousands, not the hundreds of thousands, but the millions of people like them in the United States, not only are they invisible as far as the official statistics on homelessness are concerned, not only have their experiences by and large been written out of the story that we as a nation have told ourselves about homelessness, the reasons people could become homeless and who is becoming homeless. We have a very narrow sense, most of us as the American public, in what that population looks like, largely confined to what we see on the street. And what we see on the street, I suggest, is really just the tip of the iceberg. There's this entire world of homelessness that is out of sight and hidden from view. But when we begin to look at the reasons why people are, and I'm careful to say not falling into homelessness, but being pushed into homelessness, when we begin to look at those reasons, we see that there are really all of these systems that are colliding to make this suffering not only possible, but I would argue in some ways predictable and inevitable. So it's not just a housing system that increasingly prioritizes profit above all else, where rents are just rapidly outpacing income growth in this country. And one really startling statistic that I discovered was that since 1985, rents have outpaced income gains nationwide in America by 325%. And many of your listeners, I'm sure, will be familiar with the statistic from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition that today there isn't a single city, state, or metro area in the country where someone working full-time at the local minimum wage, which is often higher than the federal minimum wage, can afford just a modest 2-bedroom apartment. And I believe there are 7 counties in the U.S. where they can afford a 1-bedroom. So it's not just the reality of what housing is, how volatile and insecure housing has become for so many. And it's not even just the wages side of that equation. As important as that is, that wages haven't kept up by any stretch of the imagination with housing costs. It's also the nature of work itself. It's the stripping away of labor protections. It's the gigification of entire sectors of the U.S. economy, where more and more people don't know how many hours they're going to be working from one week to the next. They are given 29 hours a week at their contracted position because at 30 they would be eligible for health benefits or sick leave. It's that work itself has been degraded over the past several years. It's also a lack of affordable childcare, lack of access to childcare, and the fact that it is unaffordable. It's a lack of affordable health care. It's the credit score system where a 3-digit number has come to determine for millions of people in this country whether they will have access to something as basic as a place to live. It's all of these, what I would suggest, are kind of uniquely
Yes.
American system failures, or from another perspective, systems working as they are intended that have produced this crisis. One last thing I should mention is just gentrification and kind of the revitalization of urban space. Here, Atlanta is kind of, I would suggest, representative of any number of other cities across the country that over the past decade have seen a kind of celebrated renaissance, a transformation of its urban center, where what used to be called the inner city is now, filled with all these new amenities and green space and has become kind of a playground for those with enough money to afford those amenities. And meanwhile, poor and working class people, the very people whose labor is powering that growth, making our cities run, are not just being priced out of the neighborhoods they grew up in, but pushed out of housing altogether. And so that relationship between development on the one hand and deprivation on the other is also kind of at the heart of the story I'm trying to tell in this book.
And it was very evident with the stories that were told and these families and the describing of the community. And so let's fold Mandy into the conversation, because Mandy's also from Atlanta and oversees HomeAid Georgia. But Mandy, your work in Georgia brings in many aspects some practical housing solutions to building and renovating homes that are serving these families that either are experiencing or at risk of homelessness. So many people will be familiar with you and the work of HomeAid, but for those that aren't, tell us about HomeAid Georgia's model and how you're connecting the needs that Brian's highlighting to your work.
We're really at HomeAid Georgia trying to meet families where they are. So not necessarily by any very specific definition of homelessness. And I know there are a few, and we can get more specific about that. But what we do is we work with the building industry and existing nonprofits that are providing housing. We get discounts and donations from our builder friends so that our nonprofit friends can benefit from their expertise and renovate or build from scratch or whatever they need to improve their facility so they can help more people. So the goal is always that everybody is moving forward with their lives, and our mission is to build new lives for people experiencing or at risk of homelessness through construction, community education, and engagement. And we do that in a variety of ways. So one of the main things is construction. This year, we have 2 ongoing projects. One is for an organization called Peace Place up in Jackson County, which is northeast of the Metro Atlanta core, and they provide domestic violence space for families. They had 16 beds, and when we're done, they're going to have 32. So that's a big jump for their service, much needed service up in that area. And then we're working on a project in Decatur. And Decatur is kind of an area that is focused on in the book, adjacent to Atlanta, DeKalb County, and that is for recovery from addiction. So there are women that are living in these houses that are recovering, and we're building 2 brand new houses. So they'll have space for women and then women that still have custody of their children that are in the recovery process. So those are the projects we're working on now. Do a lot of community outreach initiatives where we're providing things like diapers and wipes and other essential items to folks that are experiencing literal homelessness. But everything we do is collaborative and in partnership, and just trying to see what we can do to make a difference for homelessness at any way that it shows up.
In Brian's book, definitely gets into these stories, and you and I both have gone through it, and it's very striking because these families don't show up in traditional homelessness stats, because they're doubled up, they're living in their cars. We touched on the extended stay hotels, et cetera. But how does HomeAid Georgia really reach those hidden populations? And you mentioned the domestic violence shelter that you're working on. How do you see the connections taking place to the people that might be their lives described in Brian's book?
Well, and it's so important to highlight these extenuating circumstances that Brian highlights in his book, because invisibility is really one of the biggest barriers for solutions. So if you don't see it, then it's not a problem. It's not a problem that needs to be solved. And we talk all the time about, when in our sort of education arm, about the fact that probably 20% of the people experiencing homelessness are the ones who you would see at the gas station or at the intersection, or actually, panhandling because they have no other options. Most of them are sleeping in cars, and they're sleeping in extended stay hotels, or they're staying with relatives. And it's a hard problem because it's not something that you're proud of. It's not something that you want people to know about you. It's something that you go to great lengths to hide. So you don't want folks to know that you don't have somewhere to stay. You don't want people to really understand the problem, because it's embarrassing, because you're doing what you're supposed to. You're trying very hard. You have one or two jobs, and you are doing everything that you were told that would help you make it and help you have all of the American dream and everything that you need to have. So what we do is we rely on community partners. So like I said, we partner with nonprofits, and they're the ones on the ground. So we're sort of helping the people that are helping the people. So school systems often identify these needs way ahead of everybody else. There are domestic violence shelters that see this issue before anybody else. And then our community partners that are embedded in the communities and really understanding the need where they are and meeting folks where they are. So that's how we identify these populations, is that we just listen and we talk to people with lived experience. We talk to people that are already providing these resources, and we just help to amplify their efforts.
Yeah. And Brian, Mandy touched on a really important point, and it was woven into many of the stories that are in your book, of the, lack of a better word, the embarrassment when they're asked, because there were several of them in the stories that they were asked, well, are you homeless, or are you okay? Can you touch on that real aspect of when you were translating those stories into print, what that felt like for you, or what you saw with these families when that question came up, or what they didn't think they were homeless? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, there's a moment in the book where Natalia, one of the parents in the book, is living at Extended Stay America with her husband and 3 children, and they are applying for SNAP benefits for the first time in their life. It's incredibly humiliating for them to have to do that. They have middle-class aspirations. This is not where they ever imagined they would find themselves. And on the SNAP benefits form, it asked, where are you currently living? Something to that effect. And one of the options was homeless. And Natalia, told me about how when she checked that box, homeless, it was an incredibly destabilizing, disconcerting, very, very difficult moment for her. She said at one point, my husband and I, we want to be impeccable with our words. And that's not a term that we throw around lightly, homeless. That's not a term even from a kind of theological perspective, some of the people in my book have this kind of name it and claim it theology, where if you put that label on yourself, you might become that very thing. And so, yeah, it was devastating for the parents in this book, to say nothing of their children and the embarrassment that their children experience with their classmates and so forth, to put the label homeless on themselves. But I think it's also just really important to point out that whatever labels people are themselves comfortable with, and of course the reason why homeless was such a hard term for them to identify with was because of the stigma around that term, because of the stereotypes and vilification that people experiencing homelessness in this country have been subjected to. It's also, the invisibility question is part of that is our responsibility, those of us who are not experiencing homelessness, because, who is counted and who is defined as homeless, really, it doesn't just shape public perception, it also shapes who is eligible for really essential services. So whether or not somebody wants to claim that title or that label for themselves, it's incumbent on us, or on policymakers, I would argue, to identify circumstances as constituting homelessness. The Department of Education has identified children who are living in hotels, children who are doubled up with their families as homeless, whether they recognize that or not, because that gives us a better sense of what people are dealing with in this country and how they can be helped. So I just think that whether or not someone is comfortable with that title, it really is important that we expand the lens to include those experiences that may not traditionally fall under what we would consider homeless.
I think it's really the stigma. They have the same perception. They think of somebody that is homeless as somebody that is on the side of the road. And they have a place, they have a roof. So they don't really want to be in that category. They don't want to be literally on the side of the road. And so I think that's part of it too. Just everybody has this whole, it's our fault. Somehow we did something wrong, that we are in this circumstance, and people, the public at large, really believes that a person experiencing homelessness has their responsibility. They should do better. They should know better. They should try harder, whatever. But the one thing that I really appreciated about the book was that it's a system failure. It's a lack of housing. It's a lack of affordable housing. It's a lack of programs. It's not necessarily the fault of the people that are experiencing homelessness, but they take that blame so that and make themselves invisible, because they don't want to be embarrassed and they don't want to be pointed out, well, you're bad or you're wrong.
No, and that's very, 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 very true. Both of you touched on kind of that aspect of what is officially homeless and who isn't. And Brian, in your book, you talk about the point in time count and HUD's very defined and very narrow definition of homelessness, and then the Department of Education, and the numbers are drastically different. And in my local community, when we were dealing with people to try to understand the variances, that yes, the point in time count sheds a light on this. The Department of Education numbers count doubled and tripled up in people in hotels. It was really important to define it, because people would say, well, wait a minute, your numbers don't make sense. But both of you have talked about, the storytelling and media and public discussion. How can we amplify those things to make people really feel that they understand not only the stats, but the real stories? Are there other things that we should be doing in addition to things like this conversation today? And this is for either one of you.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. I think it's really important to point out that storytelling and narrative has been absolutely indispensable to what Mandy was just describing, to the perpetuation of stigma and myths and stereotypes. These perceptions of homeless men, women, and to the extent that children are allowed into our discussions of homelessness, those perceptions did not just emerge naturally. They did not just emerge on their own. They were produced through a combination of a kind of concerted attempt on the part of certain government officials, politicians, pundits, and also media in kind of shaping the national discourse and imagination around homelessness. And I was startled to find, that this really had its origins in the 1980s, when mass homelessness first erupted in the United States and its modern manifestation. There was really a concerted effort to ensure that average Americans, when they looked around their cities and saw the growing ranks of those who were newly without homes, that they not link that visible reality with policies, with concrete systems and policies that had been enacted at that time, really just slashing the social safety net across the board, not only with regard to housing, but with regard to labor protections, with regard to wages, with regard to healthcare, all across the safety net. And so instead of connecting it with policies, people began to blame, as Mandy said, people experiencing homelessness for their own plight, blaming the victim, so to speak. And by the end of the 1990s, the New York Times and CBS News conducted a poll asking people at random, what causes homelessness? And the number one answer that people gave, that respondents gave, was laziness or refusal to work. The number two answer was psychological problems, then alcoholism and addiction. Not a single respondent mentioned housing. And I think it just speaks to not only, how pervasive these myths had become, but also the role of institutions like the New York Times, CBS News, the very people conducting that poll, they had played a part in the answers that were given to that poll. Never mind that even during that time, the fastest growing segment of the homeless population in America were children under the age of 6. That did not come into the headlines. That did not appear in our film depictions of homelessness, our magazine stories about homelessness. And so, yeah, storytelling is very effective in the kind of negative understandings, the negative stigma and myths. But my hope is that it can also be incredibly potent in changing that narrative. And it can be a cliche, I think, to say that how important it is to put a human face on this catastrophe or any crisis. But I very much believe that before we can fix the homelessness crisis, we first have to feel this crisis. We have to feel it. We have to see what it looks and feels like for parents, for their kids, when one of these most basic human necessities is just always out of reach, no matter how hard they work, no matter how hard they try. And so that is really what the book is trying to accomplish, is to take what might otherwise be an abstraction, the housing crisis, the homelessness crisis, force even those who have been steeped in housing policy, steeped in direct services with homeless populations, to sort of shock them anew with the human tragedy, the human devastation that is this crisis in reality.
I think for me, it's really important to have both. I mean, so understanding the statistics that it is not just an isolated incident, where if you're telling someone's personal story, you may think, oh, well, it's their fault. It's this person experiencing homelessness, not across the board. So I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about the book as well, is that you have the overall stat. So you're not alone. You're not talking about these 5 families and it's only these 5 families. That they represent a much larger population that are experiencing the same issues. So I think it has to be a little bit of both, but statistics often fall flat, and statistics can be, manipulated depending on what kind of story you're trying to tell. So that's why I think the personal stories to back it up are so important, and that people really understand. When we have groundbreakings and ribbon cuttings for our projects, we always try, it's not always possible, but we always try to have a graduate from the program that we're working with speak. So somebody that's come through this circumstance of homelessness and is kind of on the other side, to tell the story about how did they get here and how are they doing now and that kind of thing. And I've had, big, burly, grown men, builders, tough guys, break down in tears just because they didn't know and they didn't realize. And they're happy to be helpful, but then just building something is very different than building something for somebody that is a real person that has, a nursing degree, but somehow, given a set of circumstances beyond their control, is now experiencing homelessness. And how do they move out of that circumstance of homelessness, and how do they get back on their feet? So it's all important. And I'm excited that people are paying attention and that housing is a bigger part of a lot of policy discussions, from city to county to, nationally. The housing shortage is a major conversation now.
Mandy, I'm glad you touched on that last part of it with policy. And are you seeing some practical things, and Brian as well, just even there in Atlanta, that electeds or people that are involved with crafting policy, that the lights are going on, or is it still falling a little bit on deaf ears?
I think it's about half, because I think everybody's talking about housing affordability and what are we doing about housing affordability. And then, on the other hand, they're enacting policies that make housing less affordable. So it just depends on implementation. The good news is the conversations are being started. One of the great things within the city of Atlanta is our current mayor, who was just sworn in for his second term recently, is very focused on housing. I mean, he has goals that he set from his initial campaign to make housing affordable and safe, and all neighborhoods safe in Atlanta. So that's a big national spotlight on the Capitol. There was a recent article that I think that you shared with me, Scott,
Yep.
and we talked about on another conversation this morning, that Georgia State University was commissioned by DeKalb County to do a study specifically on extended stay hotels and to really evaluate within DeKalb County what the issue was. And I'm just looking at some statistics that they said 4,600 people were in the extended stay hotels. 2,000 of them were households, and over 1,600 were children that were living in these extended stay. So you told all the stories in the book, Brian, but people are actually doing studies and showing, yes, this is true, and what are we going to do about it? And the CEO of DeKalb County is very focused on housing, just hired a chief of housing, which is not a position that she had in the past. So that's good news. Our state legislature is in session right now, and there are tons of bills that are focused on housing. Most representative would be the House Bill 689, which is the Georgia Stable Family and Homelessness Prevention Act, which is very specific. And it's basically trying to establish through the State Housing Trust Fund something that's focused more on homelessness prevention and getting people out of homelessness and preventing it in the first place. And so that kind of thing is happening at all three levels, city, county, and state. And there are policies that we saw worked. I mean, COVID was a horrible time for a lot of families, but it also provided ways to help families that people weren't paying attention to. They didn't realize nobody had Wi-Fi. They didn't realize, folks are living in extended stay hotels and trying to do school online with their children. So I think that shone a spotlight and also gave some concrete examples of if you just give some people a little bit of extra money, they can get out of their circumstances. They can put a deposit on an apartment, or they can pay off a debt that is preventing them from getting into stable housing. So trusting the folks that are in the circumstances to know best how to get out of their circumstances, I think was proven during COVID. And, a lot of those subsidies have gone away. But again, reminding folks this is still an issue. Just because we don't have the funding to support it at the federal level right this minute doesn't mean that families are in less crisis, and probably means they're in more crisis.
Absolutely. And Kevin Adler touches on that aspect of a little bit of money, entrusting the individual with that money and the decisions that they will make with it can really change their life. It could be a deposit. It could be, the ability to pay their car payment and prevent it from being repossessed. Brian, you touched on a number of your families had those circumstances where someone was given $50 and it changed things. But Brian, Mandy mentioned that study on the extended stay, and I know you're familiar with it as well. Can you touch on your takeaways from that extended stay study that was just recently released and some of your thoughts and takeaways from it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just confirms what those of us who have, been investigating this phenomenon have already intuited, or, there have been other data sources like Department of Education data on students living in hotels, where what we're seeing is that, people are living in these hotels not because they are on vacation or because it's a, traveling healthcare worker who needs to stay at an extended stay hotel for a couple of weeks, or, a family whose house is being repaired. People are really using these hotels as shelter of last resort. I think the study definitely confirms that these hotels are functioning as homeless shelters in effect. And where these hotels are proliferating most dramatically are regions and cities and counties where other options simply don't exist, including a family shelter space. So, I saw with families in the book, they might have considered going to a family shelter, but that option was not there. And so instead, they're going to hotels where, as the study showed, people are spending, in some cases, double what they would spend for an apartment next door or down the road for a squalid room, for really subpar conditions. And I saw these conditions up close. I kind of embedded myself at one hotel in DeKalb County called Efficiency Lodge. I mean, all manner of just horrific conditions there, but people were spending outrageous sums of money, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other options. And it just, one thing that I think we would be remiss to leave out of this conversation is just how profitable all of this insecurity has become for some in America. This housing crisis, this homelessness crisis has become big business for some very powerful financial institutions. Wall Street investors are seeing how extended stay hotels amid a national housing crisis are becoming places of last resort. To give one example, Blackstone and Starwood Capital, two private equity giants, they, during the pandemic, saw that extended stay hotels were at 80%, 90% occupancy, while many other, so-called traditional hotels were at 0% occupancy because of the pandemic. Blackstone and Starwood Capital spent $6 billion to buy Extended Stay America, where Maurice and Natalia and their children, who are in the book, where they were living, where over the course of 7 months, they spent $18,000 on their studio-sized room. There's a lot of money being made off of this desperation, and I think it's important to note that, and to also note the very powerful lobbying forces and others who would resist attempts to either improve conditions at these places or crack down on some of the more predatory and exploitative practices that exist in these places.
And that's very evident in what both you touched on in Southern California around resort districts, that there's a lot of these extended stay motels, et cetera, that families have been living in for years, and individuals, because that's the only thing that's available for them. And you're right, it is for many a profit center. I know that in and around the Disneyland, Knott's Farm area, Anaheim and Buena Park, there was an attempt to buy some of these motels, probably 10, 15 years ago. But the owners would say no, because it was so much revenue that was coming in for them. And clearly they were not the tourist motels that were built in the 50s, 60s, and 70s anymore. They were exactly what you were describing, Brian. So what can our listeners take away for, how is all this housing instability connected to economic justice and a community's overall well-being? Because in Atlanta or in other areas where there is the gentrification happening, that's viewed as we're improving our communities, but there's also very much economic challenges that come along with that for those that are being displaced. Can either one of you share some takeaways that either you will have or that you want our listeners to know to understand that balance, this economic justice and community well-being?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that, and we could take up another couple hours getting into that. But I think even in the question itself is already a really vital intervention to even frame solutions to homelessness around justice and to frame homelessness as a manifestation of injustice is already an incredible sign of progress, I think. The way that homelessness has been framed in America for decades has been around a kind of binary of either, on the one hand, vilification, demonization, the perpetuation of these harmful myths, pathologizing individuals, as we've been talking about, or on the other hand, at best, viewing homelessness through a lens of compassion and empathy and charity. And I remember early on in my reporting on these issues, when I was reporting the magazine story about one family in Atlanta, I was interviewing a tenant organizer here with a group called Housing Justice League. And this organizer, her name was Natalie, she said to me, when a family loses their home, in the case of this family who I was writing about, their lease had been prematurely terminated because their investor landlord decided it was a great time to sell. Their home was near the Beltline and their lease was prematurely terminated, even though they were ideal tenants. They were doing everything right. Natalie said to me, she said, Brian, when a family becomes homeless and that was the precipitating event, what's needed in response is not charity, but justice. And that was a really profound kind of paradigm shift for me. And I think that when we identify the systems and the policies and the structures that are at every turn, not just in these families' journeys, but in the journeys of millions of people in this country right now, militating actively against their security, I think that, again, the proper response, charity is wonderful. Compassion is wonderful. I'm not arguing against that, but it's not enough. And I think that we need to translate empathy into real systemic policy change that, as Mandy mentioned, both gets people into homes they don't currently have, gets people out of homelessness, but just as crucially, if not more crucially, prevents homelessness from happening to begin with. And that involves a conversation around tenant protections. It involves a conversation around eviction defense and legal aid and representation in eviction cases. It involves conversations around habitability requirements for housing, all sorts of things that I think have traditionally been left out of our discussions of homelessness per se.
I would echo a lot of what Brian said. I mean, I think the biggest thing is, the fact that life is less affordable right now, and a lot more people that have never had to rely on any of these systems are starting to have to. The food insecurity and just all kinds of different things that never entered their mind. I mean, I say all the time when we talk about housing affordability, can your kid live in your neighborhood? Could your grown child that went to college buy a house in your neighborhood? And the answer is almost exclusively no. I mean, because where they are, if they've been there for any length of time, has appreciated so much and stuff has been built around it. And just that it's not a place that somebody starting out can start their life. And so then it's not so much about those people and them, and they should do something to help themselves, or even maybe policy should change to help those people, because now we're all those people. So as unfortunate as it is that a lot more people are in this boat, or at least, leaning, and their boat is tilting to the side now, I think it's going to be helpful in the long run. Like Brian was saying, we have to feel this before we can change this. And I think many more people feeling it and understanding this is not a personal failure. This is a system failure. This is a policy failure. I mean, housing should be a human right. We talk about that a lot of times in our circles, like in our housing advocacy circles. Housing is healthcare. Housing is, necessity. Somewhere to sleep at night that is safe is a minimum standard for humanity. And we are not achieving that minimum. So I would hope that this awareness that this book is bringing, and just the fact that, again, it is a national conversation now. That bill that I mentioned is just one of probably 10 different bills that are focused on housing that are being debated right now in the Georgia legislature. So I'm hopeful that this session is going to yield some policy changes that can produce real systemic progress. It's hard to say. It's really hard to say. And the good news is our governor, this is kind of his last term, so he's probably very focused on getting some things done, and he's a home builder. So I'm hoping for all of those reasons that things may progress a little more this year. It's a second year and a 2-year session. So basically a bill that gets introduced one year has 2 years to get passed. And so we're in that second year. So I think there's going to be just a lot of momentum based on the conversations and based on just observable reality. And this touching a lot more people than it's touched in the past. So it's not those people, it's us, we all.
Yeah, and Mandy, one of the things that you and I both see across the HomeAid network is, as you work on these projects, is you're bringing builders and trades and others into a situation that they may normally not have seen. I mean, they build, but not building for emancipated foster youth, or building for domestic violence, or building for individuals caught in human trafficking, or families that are experiencing homelessness. There's a lot of awareness that comes about from that. And dignity, like you'd mentioned, the one builder who didn't realize the stories. Can you share a little bit more on that, of what you're seeing and the change, even in just your own world, of how dignity is coming along with the awareness with some of the people that you're bringing to these projects for families, et cetera?
Well, one of the great things that my board chair shared with me as he was rolling off this year was just that, when we're doing these projects, the change is in the lives that are going to be touched by this facility, but it's also in the people that are working on the facility. So interacting with these service providers that are on the front lines day to day, dealing with people experiencing real crisis, the change is really in talking to them, being on site and listening and seeing what's going on and how this space is going to provide a place for people to just catch their breath. And most of the time, the nonprofits that we're working with, that's what it is. It's more of a landing pad. Stay here. Let's get everything figured out. Let's get you stable. Let's figure out next steps so that you just can breathe, because that's the main thing. Is you can't make any plans if you're in crisis mode all the time. So if your next thought is, where are we going to sleep tonight? How are you going to save any money? How are you going to get a different job? How are you going to worry about your kids' homework? That's not the priority. The priority is, where are we going to sleep tonight? And so a lot of these service providers are providing that space, that safe space, so that people can think and make plans and restore dignity to these to their lives. I mean, they're restoring community. They've separated themselves from everybody because of the stigma. So it's just so many supports that we enjoy just in regular life. If you're in crisis mode, you don't get those luxuries. And just understanding that all people deserve a safe, dignified place to call home is, I think, a really foundational thing that happens in every project that we're doing. And
Yep.
to the people that are working on it, to the people that are benefiting from it, it's so important that you understand that dignity is a necessity.
Yep. I couldn't agree more. Brian, as we look to kind of wrap things up, what's one thing you hope policymakers or community leaders like Mandy's been mentioning take from your reporting that can truly reduce homelessness and make an impact?
I hope that policymakers, as well as just ordinary readers who encounter these stories, I hope there's a lot that I hope they walk away with. But one thing I really hope they walk away with is a feeling of anger. I want people who read this book to be angry. I want the anger that I was feeling when I was reporting this book over a period of nearly 6 years, immersed in these families' lives and just feeling, to be honest, and many times a feeling of kind of impotent rage at the utterly preventable moments that were just exacerbating the suffering, that were contributing to what public health researchers termed the toxic stress that the children in particular were exposed to, stress that was so chronic, so debilitating that it could literally alter a children's long-term development. I was feeling a lot of anger during that, and I want readers to walk away with what might be termed a productive anger, not just
Yes.
an anger without object and a kind of amorphous, ambiguous anger, but an anger that is specific and clear, above all, about how solvable this is. And also clear about what we've allowed housing to become in the richest nation on the planet. I remember during the pandemic, there was a lot of public outrage when hand sanitizer and N95 masks were being hoarded up and then sort of sold on eBay and Amazon for $90 a pop, $80 a pop. And there were calls for people who were doing this to be prosecuted. And I remember thinking, that's what we've allowed housing to become. We've allowed this essential thing, this basic human necessity that, as Mandy mentioned, is fundamental to people's health. And during the pandemic, literally not having housing could be a death sentence. It could expose you to a deadly virus. We have allowed for it to be hoarded up and, in effect, put into a giant U-Haul truck and then sold off to the highest bidder. And we basically said that whatever the market will allow, that is what we will force people to be subjected to. And a case manager in my book, Carla Wells, she refers to this as the housing hunger games. And I think that readers will hopefully read these stories and see just how avoidable this entire situation is, how fixable it is, and what a grievous injustice it is that we've allowed this to happen to our neighbors.
Yeah, well said. Mandy, in responding to that from Brian, what's on Georgia's horizon, HomeAid Georgia, and are there initiatives or partnerships that you see that dovetail into this conversation?
Well, we're celebrating our 25th anniversary this year, so we're excited to have been trying to figure this out for that long and keep on keeping on. And so really we're just going to kind of scale what works. I mean, we've done this for a while. One of the projects that I'm excited about is we're going to partner on a couple of different projects with Habitat. People are realizing much more so that housing is a spectrum. So, you don't go from being stably housed to literally being on the street, but there are, kind of steps along the way, and prevention is one of the issues, but an increase in housing stock is another major issue, the fact that there's just not enough housing for anybody at any price point. And so we're partnering with Habitat in Athens, Georgia, to provide, they're building a whole village. 15 of the units at this village are going to be for youth that are aging out of the foster care system, and they'll be run by an organization called Lydia's Place. So we're excited to partner on those particular houses. We're saying we're doing 15 houses in 15 days. Hadn't quite figured out the math and the schedule, but sounds good. So we're going to do that. It won't be 15 consecutive days, I can tell you that. But how it shakes out, we're still sort of planning that. But we are hoping to start that in April. We're finishing up a couple of projects, one of which is the domestic violence shelter I mentioned earlier, and then the house that is providing space for women in recovery. Those two should finish in March. And then the other big thing is we're doing a lot more, a lot more into advocacy, which is, I think, how this book connects a lot with what we do in education and letting folks know what the issues are and how they are preventable. And one of the things that we didn't really mention that I think that the building industry has really kind of gotten behind is just the fact that 30% of the cost of every house is regulation. So there's just a lot of things that the city, county, state can do to reduce that price. So land costs are astronomical, but holding costs are also astronomical. So if you don't give a permit and there's no sort of time frame certain that you're going to be able to get a permit, then that also adds cost. The other thing is there's a lot of municipalities that have unending moratoriums on building. And so then you can't build anything. You can't get to a place where you're increasing the housing stock because you're not allowed. And so I think everybody's approaching it at a different angle. And I feel really fortunate to be kind of on both sides of the conversation. So on the housing advocacy side of the conversation, but also having so many friends in the building industry, being able to kind of speak both languages and bring it together and say, okay, we all want the same things. We all want to be able to provide housing at an attainable price, an attainable rate, and increase the housing stock. So I think that's where I really want to focus this year is as we're expanding throughout the state, there are different issues in different areas. Lack of housing is an issue in all areas. And just being able to kind of bridge that gap and have folks talk to each other and realize we're all saying the same thing. We all want more housing and more attainable housing. And we can make that happen if we all work together.
Well, and Mandy, you're in a very unique position as your colleagues within HomeAid are across the country and bridging between so many different people and bringing that message of we are wanting all the same thing. Well, Brian and Mandy, this has been just a very rich conversation today. And we've connected storytelling that expands what we consider as homelessness. And we've talked about services and housing solutions and what communities are facing day in and day out. Brian, your book, There's No Place for Us, reminds us that homelessness is not just a fringe issue. It's deeply connected to housing affordability, economic opportunity, and how we count and then support our neighbors. Mandy, I truly appreciate the work that you're doing in Georgia. And it shows that when communities come together, our builders, the nonprofits, the volunteers and leaders, we can make dignity and housing stability a reality for more and more people, one person, one family at a time. So to our listeners, if today's conversation has moved you, please pick up Brian's book and consider how we can expand our definitions of homelessness and the solutions, and reach out to HomeAid affiliates like HomeAid Georgia that's near you to learn how you can help build a future without homelessness. Thanks for listening to Unsheltered Conversations. I'm Scott Larson, and we'll see you next time.